Welcome, welcome. It is wonderful to see everybody. This is wonderful. Dr. Collicott, I'll defer to you.
Nice to see everyone here.
Joanna, yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're all here. It may be that some others join us shortly. Welcome everybody to this particular meeting of the Oxford Interfaith Forum. I'll introduce myself first, as I'm chairing the session, and most of you probably don't know me. My name is Joanna Collicott, and I'm a psychologist of religion and work in the university here. And it's because I'm a psychologist of religion that I was invited to chair this very exciting session with Professor Lisa Miller, who is going to be presenting to us. And I'm going to begin shortly by introducing her properly, but just to explain the structure of the session. Professor Miller will talk for 40-45 minutes. We may have a little bit of practical experiential stuff as part of that, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. And what I will do is I will look out for raised hands, electronically raised hands, or if yours isn't working, you can wave at me, and then I'll invite you to unmute to ask your questions then, and I'm sure there will be many of them. So it is a great pleasure and honour to welcome Professor Miller here to us today. She is a professor in the clinical psychology programme at Teachers College at Columbia University, and she's the author of New York Times bestsellers The Spiritual Child, and more recently this book, The Awakened Brain. And she's going to talk about some of the ideas in that book to us today. She is the founder of the Spirituality, Mind, Body Institute, which was the first Ivy League research institute and place of graduate study in spirituality and psychology. She's held over a decade of joint appointments in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University Medical School. And her innovative research has been supported by millions of dollars in grants and is published in more than 100 peer-reviewed journal articles, including in journals including Cerebral Cortex, the American Journal of Psychiatry, JAMA Psychiatry, and the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Professor Miller is the president and CEO and member of the Board of Trustees of the Collaborative for Spirituality in Education. She's a founding co-editor-in-chief of the American Psychological Association journal Spirituality in Clinical Practice, and a founding associate editor of Psychology of Religion and Spirituality, a key journal in the field of psychology of religion. She's an elected fellow of the American Psychological Association and twice president of the APA Society for Psychology, Religion and Spirituality. Professor Miller is the editor of the first and the second forthcoming editions of the Oxford Handbook of Psychology and Spirituality, which is a book I also have on my shelf and refer to frequently. So I'm looking forward to the second edition. So it's a great pleasure to have you, Professor Miller, with us today. We envy you, your situation and the weather that we can see out there behind you, and we very much look forward to having you speak to us now.
Dr. Collicott, thank you. And I so enjoy seeing you, my colleagues, on this Zoom. And some of you I have seen a few times in the past few months, which gives me great hope that we are knitting together a global academic community around a foundationally spiritual look into psychology, healing, renewal, a spiritual look into a deeper pedagogy during the very formative time of our students. So as we come to see each other more and more, I hope that we will become a really colleagues, which although we would say we are global colleagues, it feels very intimate in these Zooms. So I'm honoring our collaboration in leaning into this work together. So let me start by something that I feel is, for those of you who work with young adults, teenagers, really, if you will, urgent and will not surprise you, but of course pertains as well to all of us, to every decade in the human life. And that is right now, the process of our reemergence, the process of our reawakening, if you will, into this next moment of our global shared journey. I'm going to, if I will, just open up share screen. So I'm coming to you from the Spirituality Mind Body Institute. About 15 years ago, I started at Columbia University Teachers College, where I've been a professor for about 2 decades. The Spirituality Mind Body Institute, and I, with a great amount of energy, put spirituality up front, because there's lots of wonderful work going on at the mind-body level. But I was finding back then, 15 years ago, that there was a certain trepidation in academia, if you will, in the air and water of our culture, a latent radical materialism that made everybody sort of tiptoe around the language of spiritual. So words that were perhaps downstream of spiritual life. So one who's spiritual is likely very compassionate. One is often reflective or mindful. And those important words and dimensions of human life carry great value, but they are not identical with spiritual. And it came into my awareness through this work since really the late 90s, that spiritual means spiritual. And I haven't heard another word that means spiritual per se. And so I use the language, because unless I use the language, I feel it is often obfuscated what we're talking about. And in particular, the science I'm going to share with you is the science that was foundational to starting the Institute, that has now grown from really a research hub to include a place of convening, as we're doing here now, convening educators, convening people who are healers, activists, and third pillar, a place for field change, where we all come together and work to seed a more spiritually aware society. So science, convening, and a place for field change, where we work in collaboration. So this is something, again, those of you who are my colleagues will not be surprised to see, but certainly in the United States, and I've come to hear in the past year or so that this may be true for a great number of our communities in global post-industrial culture. That is, that spirituality and religion are not understood as two different things or two related things, that really much of the public square has become a bit tone deaf, or if you will, spiritually non-conversant around this dimension, this central dimension of our lives, so much so that this needs to be explained. Or I've found that often 2 hours later, someone will pull me aside and ask for this distinction. And it's this, that there are many beautiful faith traditions in our shared world. There is Judaism and Hinduism and Catholicism and Jains and so many beautiful faith traditions. And through the lens of science, if you ask a scientist, well, what's the difference between religion and spirituality? A scientist would say that religion is 100% environmentally transmitted, which is to say it is a gift of our parents and grandparents. It is a gift of our community. If we choose a faith tradition, we then surround ourselves in the community to learn more deeply the deeper significance of those tenets. So religion, through the lens of science, and more specifically a twin study, is 100% environmentally transmitted. Spirituality, through a twin study, is innate. We are all born, just as we're born with 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose, a beating heart, we are born innately spiritual beings. How do we know this? Well, a twin study can determine the extent to which any human capacity is innate or environmentally formed. Our temperament, whether we are laid back or more front-footed, our temperament, whether we're open or more closed, introverted or extroverted, this is half hardwired. It is inborn. And yet, if I might use the example of raising infants, I've raised 3, and the center child would cry 4 times a night, uncomfortable, for 18 months. I'd walk over to her, I would soothe the baby 4 times a night, and she now has a deep peace in the night. She sleeps through the night. She's 20. And she has also allowed me to say she's a bit anxious. Temperament is half innate, half environmentally formed. IQ, everyone here is very bright, 60% innate, 40% environmentally formed. The capacity through which we experience transcendent life, the neuroseat of transcendent awareness, and in particular, more specifically, a relational spirituality with one another and to our higher power. Some people say God, Jesus, Hashem, Allah. Some people say the force in and through all life. Whatever our words may be, the deep felt sense of relationship, transcendent relationship, is 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed, which means that our pastor, priest, imam, rabbi, our parents and grandparents all weigh in to shape the spiritual core. But the spiritual core is our birthright. So right now, I'd like to show you where in the brain this birthright sits, and it's here. These broad and pervasive regions represented in red are regions of cortical thickness in people who do build the muscle. And in particular, in this study, which we published in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association Psychiatry, it was a first in a series of these articles in 2014. These broad and pervasive regions represent cortical thickness, processing power. By way of analogy, a stronger muscle, a built muscle, across the parietal, precuneus, and occipital, which are regions of perception, reflection, and orientation. So now I might invite you to hit pause, and I'd like to share with you a moment of engaging your own innate capacity for transcendent awareness, what I'm calling the awakening of your own natural spirituality. You may have done this many times already today. You may have done this thousands and thousands of times in the past year, but I'm inviting you to do it now. And in sharing with you this practice in the language of life that was taught to me, I always think my teacher, by the late Dr. Gary Weaver, in the hopes that it might be useful to you and perhaps you may find would be helpful to someone else in your life for whom this connection is not so immediately formed. Maybe they had not much of a 2/3 embrace of their natural spiritual core. So I'll invite you to close your eyes, clear out your inner space, and take 7 breaths to open up your inner chamber. I invite you to set before you a table. This is your table. And to your table, you may invite anyone, living or deceased, who truly has your best interest in mind. Anyone living or deceased who truly has your best interest in mind. And with them all sitting there, ask them if they love you. And now you may invite your higher self, the part of you that is much more than anything you've done or not done, anything you have or don't have, your true, eternal higher self. And ask you if you love you. And now finally, you may invite your higher power, however you know, whatever words are yours, God, Spirit, Jesus, the universe, however you know, and ask your higher power if they love you. And now with all of those people sitting there right now, what do they need to share What do they need to let you know? What do they need to tell you now? And when you're ready, I'll invite you back. This is your birthright. And this is your counsel. They will always be there for you. Who shows up may change depending on where you are in your path. And you may ask what is on your heart at different moments of your life. But no one can ever take this away from you. This is who we are as innately spiritual beings. And the transcendent relationship felt with God, the higher power. Some people have said Mount Rainier out in Seattle showed up in that chair. However, you know, ultimate force of creation, life source. And the presence of that sacred source in and through our love for one another. Relational spirituality. Your capacity not merely to believe, but to know, to feel the deep way of being through which we are in authentic, dynamic relationship is our birthright. Now, 40 years ago in the States, and I've come to see in a great number of communities across post-industrial global culture, religion was thrown out of the public square. And it was done often in the good attempt to be inclusive, but turned out to be radically exclusive, because in that was lost the rich embrace of pluralism, where through the 2/3 embrace of your faith tradition or the voice of spirituality lived in nature, whatever your path may be, we connected very, very deeply and can continue to connect very, very deeply when we engage at the level of our awakened brain, the spiritual core. But when we threw all religion out of the public square, we became spiritually non-conversant and even a little unsure and sheepish around how to bring that up. And maybe it's a side conversation or whispered. We threw the spiritual baby out with the bathwater. 40 years ago, I remember it. I'm 56. When I was 16, came the sea change. And when that happened, well, 40 years ago was long enough for us to grow up, have a child who's now 18 and at your door if you are in higher education. And sure enough, we have now a global post-industrial culture of young adults who have never faced a pandemic of the diseases of despair. An 18 through 25-year-old is far more likely to die of suicide than of COVID, cancer, or an auto accident. There has never been a time where our young adults, late adolescents, have faced as elevated rates of addiction, depression, anxiety, suicide, all around post-industrial global culture. And with that comes fragility. And there's been a crisis, which I hear from everywhere from higher education to the military to entry-level jobs in relational ethics. How'd we get here? Well, traditionally, we have looked at the level of the individual. He meets criteria for depression. She has an addiction. I question that person's relational ethics. But when this is an epidemic, as of September, 46% of young adults had a moderate level of a disease of despair. Moderate means enough to be impaired in their daily living. Moderate means enough to fare a very heavy load on their heart. Clinically moderate, not feeling okay. This is best understood in the air and water of our culture. This is a tidal wave that is swallowing up young people. And when we look statistically at the sharp escalation in the diseases of despair. It is statistically concomitant with the decline in spiritual life and family faith tradition. That is why this matters to us here now, when we have a global pandemic. The science is in the awakened brain. So all of the science I'm about to share with you now, the one on the left is the UK paperback, which I love that it has a little penguin. Well, anyway, the UK paperback has all the references. So I'm going to share with you in aggregate the findings, but in the awakened brain, you can pull up any specific reference, go on Google Scholar or PsycInfo and read the original article. So the awakened brain has every single article reference that I'm going to share with you in aggregate now. And the awakened brain also has cases and stories of people who've walked through the journey of the roadmap of science I'm going to share with you now that mirrors the human journey. Here's the first piece. Every one of us, every single one of us is born a naturally spiritual being. But with the attenuation of spiritual and religious life in the public square, the 2/3 environmental embrace has become very empty. And for the first time, you may well receive an undergraduate or a teenager to your faith community who has never prayed by the side of a grandparent or parent, who has never read any sacred text of any tradition, who has yet to understand morality as derived from our relationship to ultimate truth or to the higher power. So the empty 2/3 embrace has been a developmental challenge for a great number of young adults. Some still have a strong spiritual core, but never have so many suffered and struggled because it is an atrophied spiritual core. And the good news is that young adulthood, 18 through 25, it actually backs up right to when our traditions understood this to be the case. As we came of age, from early to mid-adolescence, late adolescence to emerging adulthood, there's a surge. It's marked by a 50% increase in the heritable contribution in longitudinal twin studies, which means there's a surge, a biological clock, a hunger. What is my purpose? What is my meaning? And I don't mean little p, am I going to be a lawyer or a doctor? I mean big P, the nature of my life. What is a meaningful, ultimately meaningful life so that I might go live one? And matching the drive of the head is the hunger of the heart for love and the numinous and connection. This surge in puberty, bar and bat mitzvah, the inipi, the sweat lodge, confirmation, has always been understood that with physical puberty, physical change, concomitantly comes spiritual growth. The existential hunger, college counselors say 2/3 of my caseload is this seeking of how to build a life in a deep, deep, deep foundational way. This is a developmental depression. It is effectively a knock at the door of the emergence of spiritual awakening. And it'll happen again at midlife, and it'll happen again as we cross the bridge to elderhood. We can see this through long-term clinical course studies. But the emergence of developmental depression in puberty, middle to late adolescence, emerging adulthood, is the opportunity to cultivate a spiritual response to loss and suffering, a spiritual response to despair, and to figure out what life, our life, life itself really means. It's the most important work we do, from which follows all else. Certainly our academics, our relational ethics. When the core is built, there is nothing in the clinical or social sciences as profoundly protective against the diseases of despair. American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, a 19-year-old with standard deviation above as compared to below the mean, and a tendency to say, I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. When I have a tough decision to make, I ask, what really is my higher power showing me to do? Nature is a sacred home where I derive direction. A teen who walks through life on spiritual ground is at 80% decreased relative risk for DSM diagnosis of addiction to drugs and alcohol. A teen a standard deviation above as compared to below the mean, one who doesn't know what you're talking about. 60% less likely to have major depression. Remember, every teen will have a developmental depression. The ignition is developmental depression to spiritual emergence, descend to ascend, as some traditions hold. But developing a spiritual response to suffering, building the muscle, strengthening the red brain, if you will, is associated with a 2/3 decreased relative risk of major depression, where we power down, where it's difficult to connect. We're uncomfortable even looking at people. Far less likely to take risks, driving fast, jumping out the second-story window at a party, and to the epidemic of our time directly in a meta-analysis, a study of studies. When we have a strong spiritual core that is shared in the minyan, shared in the sangha, shared in the fellowship, shared in the family, shared in the dorm, we are at 62% relative risk decreased alone, 82% when shared in community. So if I were to tell you, I've shared with you, I now have 3 18 through 25-year-olds, that there's a little pill. And if you take this little pill, you are at 4/5 decreased risk for addiction and suicide. The #1 killer of young adults, if you take this little pill. But yet this is how we're built. This is how the human is designed. And when we look at protective benefits of this scale and magnitude through the gritty, messy lens of science to see a signal at all, and then for it to be this glaringly strong, it appears that we are looking at 2 sides of one coin, which is to say that the hardwired body, mind, and soul unitive, I'm not by any means implying biological reductionism, but this natural surge of spiritual awakening in late adolescence and young adulthood to culminate in a form of walking through life on spiritual ground. That process is foundational. It is the hub of the wheel. The spiritual core stabilizes the entire wheel, ethical, moral, social development. Without it, the wheel wobbles. And I interpret these broad and pervasive findings on the impact of a strong spiritual core to suggest that we are built to be integrated with the spiritual core at the hub. And when it is not, we are very, very shaky. Developmental depression is our way there with puberty. It comes back at midlife. This time, not what is my meaning and purpose, but how have I shot half my life? Have I walked according to my spiritual values? Was I a parent that really loved and listened to my children? Did my work leave a good footprint on the earth? Did I heal the earth? Did I harm the earth? These are the questions at midlife, and they are existential questions. You know, we have nicknames of sophomore slump and midlife crisis. So to the naked eye, there's certainly something going on at these chapter breaks in our journey. And yet the depth and significance of who we are and who we may become when we honor transformational moments in our path is shown in the mirror of this science. And here is where the rubber hits the road. This is a sample of over 3,000 people. Every single person in this study has trauma. They meet criteria for PTSD. And I share this with my friends and colleagues in our global community as we've reemerged from a mass trauma of COVID. Well, in this study, what we notice is that as we go out the x-axis and face increasing levels of struggle, more anxiety, more sleeplessness, more rage, out the x-axis, up the y-axis are units of growth. More struggle, more growth, more struggle, more growth, more struggle, more growth, until we are so flooded with struggle, we need support to grow. Struggle, we are wired, we are built for struggle to be a gateway to growth, post-traumatic growth. This study is by Tsai, Tsai, again, in the back of the awakened brain are all these references. Tedeschi, also in the back of the awakened brain, Tedeschi points to 4 qualities that help us get up on top of this curve. Access to our painful loss, trauma, putting it into words, sharing it again in the group, and then shining the light of spiritual awareness onto that trauma. through which there is then a rearrangement of meaning. And then I saw we both could be forgiven. And then I knew I was not to blame. The deeper resonance of the new understanding, more true, more solidly holding in us, is post-traumatic spiritual growth. It strengthens the spiritual core. As we strengthen the spiritual core, post-traumatic spiritual growth coming out of COVID, not what did I miss, but what did I discover? Not what did I lose, but in that loss, what was God showing me now? What is life asking of me now? How might more deeply I understand what's real and what is false? I mean, certainly to be cathected to our institutions would seem shaky business now, but what's enduring is a deeper connection, the transcendent relationship, and who we can be to one another. When we live this way, when we engage our awakened brain, which is to say we can ask a question of our head, what is my next move? Where am I going back to work? A young person might say, who do I marry? What do I want to do with my life? And then receive an answer of the heart, an intuition, perhaps a gut answer, a synchronicity, a mystical experience. When we wed different forms of knowing, if you will, different hardwired epistemologies, so that at the table of human knowing is the logician, the empiricist, the mystic, the intuitive, the skeptic. In tandem, in dialogue, our brain looks like this. We myelinate the tracks, pave the highways between regions of the brain so we have a more interconnected brain, which is a more innovative brain, a more creative brain. I've worked extensively with the US Pentagon. It is a more situationally aware brain so that we can see where we are and what to do in the moment. This is our innate capacity realized. If we help young people do this by the time that they are graduating from university, it is a setup for the rest of their life. And when, as we cross the bridge through developmental depression at midlife, how have I used my life? How will I use the precious remaining chapter of my life? What God are you asking of me now? What is Spirit opening for me now? Dreams, mystical experiences, synchronicities. It is an enduring way of seeing into life. This stays with us throughout the decades of our lives. We are healthier, we are more resilient, we have stronger relational ethics and are less fragile. I'm going to end in just a moment, but I'd like now to look at the upside. We know that we are innately spiritual beings, but the 2/3 embrace is essential in strengthening the spiritual core. And for some, that's religion, and for some, there's other paths. But we are all spiritual beings who need the support, the 2/3 embrace. And that the surge in late adolescence and emerging adulthood concomitant with university is traditionally has been the university's job to create people of deep connection to ultimate purpose, people of great morality. Well, I'd like to invite you now, close your eyes, just envision for a moment a student, a young person you've known with tremendous grit, and now one with commitment, now one with optimism. How many students are you thinking of? Many people say one. They've known many wonderful students, but they say one. And that's because the character strengths and virtues cluster into the same people. This has been replicated on hundreds of thousands of people using the VIA. Grit, gratitude, meaning. Well, it turns out that all these good things, they're all high for those folks in blue, these organically derived categories using latent class analysis on 5,500 young adults. The red folks, we love just as much, and they struggle because the character strengths and virtues are valuable and value in and of their own. And yet at the same time, the character strengths and virtues provide traction. If we persist, if we're optimistic, we have more outward success as understood by traction in the world. Well, why is that? Because here's the hard work of growing up, and here's the hard work at midlife of renewing who we are every single day. Who am I? Well, as a teenager, I am the one in the top 10% of the class in math. Actually, I'm in the bottom third. I am the one who was elected to student council. Actually, nobody seems to know my name on campus. I am my outward parts, my characteristics, my successes, my failures. But who am I, door number 2, when I use my awakened brain, when I'm raised by my family, when I'm supported by my pastor, priest, imam, rabbi, and when I am guided by my college and university culture to know myself actually, who am I? I am a soul on earth. I am a being of infinite worth. I am a child of God. I may or may not be good at math. Those would be my endowments through which to carve purpose, ultimate purpose, calling, contribution. But it's not who I am. And the reason that a strong spiritual core, when shared, is 82% protective against completed suicide, the #1 killer of youth, is because the day I fail, it is disappointing. The day I fail, I might be embarrassed or ashamed. But it is not an annihilation of who I am. It is noise on the trajectory of my larger calling, my purpose. Right now, outside of high schools, door number 1, a public square, silent on spirituality, a public square in which most young adults don't know themselves in their deep sense of being as a soul on earth, a child of God. We have epidemic rates of suicide and homicide in the culture. And oftentimes it's following loss or failure. Outside of Palo Alto High School is a fence along the train track, following suicides because kids didn't do well on tests, and a full-time security guard. A public square without a spiritual core is a transactional public square. And when we put the spiritual core back in the public square, our classrooms, our boardrooms, our conversations, we move from narrowly transactional to transformational, walking side by side, because if I'm a soul on earth, you're a soul on earth, and our relationship's about interest, encouragement, on a tough day, forgiveness. But it is not only about transactions and narrow competitions. We are more to one another. Martin Buber called this an I-thou relationship. Going back to our initial opening practice, those who truly had your best interest in mind. And I invite you to think at whose tables you have shown up. This science is a science of immediate applicability right now. It doesn't need to wait. It is who we are. It uncovers who we've been all along. And it's being used as such. This is mainstream stuff. Wall Street Journal, ABC News, Barron's, Barron's, McKinsey. This is who we are, and it is applicable, Awaken Campus Global, to our colleges. It is applicable to any institutional setting. Science is a roadmap. It mirrors that which many of you have already known all along. At the table of inner human knowing, the intuitive, the mystic, knows deeply our lives to be foundationally spiritual in nature. And here the empiricist can mirror, if you will, as a religious person, I would say science is a form of witness. Mirror and witness that which we have known all along at the level of outward empiricism. So this is yours, my friends, my colleagues, to use in your own professional leadership, your own band of expertise, perhaps as a lens of looking into that congregant, that student in their lifetime course of spiritual emergence, and most foundationally for who we really are. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that stimulating overview and the opportunity for some personal experience as well. While people are thinking about questions, and I can see there are some hands going to be raised, I think I'd probably better start with one, which is a kind of challenge, really. So I'm quite involved with a number of projects that are exploring the idea of the phenomenon of resistance to psychology by theologians, a suspicion or a anxiety about psychology. And what seems to lie behind that is a kind of anxiety that religion will cease to be the holder of the kinds of things you've been talking about in your presentation, in terms of human spirituality and transcendence and so on, and that it will be replaced by psychological science as the ultimate holder of those truths. And then religion will become just one of a number of ways in which these truths can be accessed. And I wonder if you've come across that kind of response, and if you have your own answer to it.
Thank you. That is such a valuable opening for a conversation. So if I might just share a bit more science that speaks squarely to your question. When we looked at people who had a profound transcendent relationship and who felt that presence of sacredness in love for fellow human beings, relational spirituality, and fellow living beings, right? It was, the red brain, the neural correlate, if you will, is the neurodocking station. It is by no means, I'm not claiming biological reductionism. It is the neural correlate, is the concomitant neural seat of our awareness and felt knowing of the transcendent relationship, both towards who I call God, one's higher power, and the presence of God and our love for one another. You use your word or your understanding of the cosmos. Now, how do we get there? Well, it turns out that over 80% of the time, people with a strong spiritual connection are part of a community of, usually a faith community, almost always a faith community, sometimes a community of service, where relational spirituality is held in the body of the organ. So not all social support's the same. It is a place of relational spirituality that often also holds a transcendent, a shared understanding of a transcendent. But so on the road to a strong awakened brain, there is oftentimes some Sangha, Minyan, Habitat for Humanity, Doctors Without Borders. There is a place of service, love, altruism through which that is developed. And I'll tell you even more shocking science. I have a colleague, Dr. Sunya Luthar, who wonderful colleague, spent a great deal of time trying to understand the level of suffering in teens in under-resourced communities. She went to under-resourced communities, walked into the high school, and looked at every single teenager in the school carefully using assessments to see how many kids are addicted, how many kids are depressed. And one day, after about 5 years of doing this, Dr. Luther said, we need a control group. I'm going to go over there, 3 towns over. I'm going to go look at the highly resourced community. She picked up her team. She went to the highly resourced community, ran the same study, looked at the numbers, and to her surprise, and that of the field at the time, this was around 2000, identified higher rates of addiction, higher rates of despair and depression in highly resourced communities than in the inner city. She didn't know why or how, so she thought she'd look under the hood. Dr. Luther went to those very same highly resourced high schools outside New York, outside San Francisco, looked under the hood. She asked students, come here. Can you tell me who at your high school is extremely popular? Who's really popular? And they all knew, of course, that group of girls, they're super popular, and that boy, he's very popular. As an index of social esteem, what really matters here in the tidal wave, in the unspoken of the air and water of our culture. So Dr. Luther returned 2 weeks later, rounded up new students and said, tell me about that group of girls over there and that guy. And in this way, determined the actual behavioral correlates of social esteem, what is in the culture of highly resourced communities. So what might you imagine was the #1 predictor of popularity in girls. Highly resourced communities. We can do the chat. The number one predictor. What, pardon?
Appearance.
It was absolutely within the bandwidth of appearance, and quite specifically, the number one predictor of social esteem, popularity in girls in highly resourced communities is weight. Can you imagine? Parts and pieces, a transactional public square. And the number two predictor is cruelty, Mean Girls, like the musicals and the movies, Mean Girls, interpersonal aggression being used to instantiate rank. That's a tidal wave. Beautiful souls on earth show up and are in a tidal wave. And for boys, the number one predictor of popularity, it was substance use. And the number two predictor was not intimacy, but conquest. So here are beautiful souls on earth, our sons, our daughters showing up. Everyone's God's child. This is my word. You pick your words, source of all life. And that is the culture. It is a transactional culture, parts and pieces. So I teamed up with Dr. Luther and I said, let's look. I know at the level of large samples, the strong spiritual core is 80% protective against addiction. Let's look at this together. And we did. The rate at which most teens would say my personal spirituality is highly important to me is 70%. 70%. So knowing that, what might you surmise in these communities, the highly resourced communities, is the rate at which teens say, the same.
Wow.
Yes. 15, 1-5, less than a quarter. Teens from highly resourced communities are less than a quarter of the national rate in likelihood of saying my personal spirituality is highly important to me. And those 15% were doing very well. They were inured, they were protected from the otherwise elevated rates of the diseases of despair. They were not suffering like the other 85%. And so, as any parent would wonder, any pastor, priest, imam, rabbi would wonder, how do we get these wonderful young teens into that 15%? And it turns out that almost without exception, they were part of either a faith community or a community of contribution. There was somewhere else other than the school locker, where instead of being looked at as parts and pieces, good at math, thin or not thin, how much do you drink? Instead of being looked at that way, they showed up and were looked at, I am so glad to see you. How has your week been? You know, known as a soul on earth, seen as having merit. And so if I show up at my synagogue, nobody cares if I was just on the front page, you know, for something really wonderful or really awful. I'm equally loved. Right? My dad could have just gone to jail or made $20 million. It doesn't matter because we show up as a soul on earth. It's an entirely different way to see each other, relational spirituality, into existence. So when the question comes, you know, how's religion doing? Well, religion has so much packaged in there, who we are as souls on earth, how to access the transcendent, a moral code derived from ultimate reality, a language of transcendence, a language of souls on earth. It is very hard to recreate that at the kitchen table. So my view is that if you have a religion, is there a way that you can walk back into your religion if you've been estranged in an authentic way? Maybe you go down the street to the way someone else teaches it or practices it, because there's so much in there that in the intergenerational transmission of spirituality, religion is extraordinarily impactful as the 2/3 embrace. That's what the data says.
Thank you. And you talked about that intergenerational transmission in your book as well, in a really instructive way.
And if I may, I just want to go back to this right here, this image right here. This cannot be said enough times every day. In a post-industrial global culture where we have been silenced on religion and spirituality, we have a spiritually non-conversant contemporary global culture. And I think many, many people, very smart people, when it comes to this topic, do not discern as they might on other topics. So it is indeed an evocative topic, and for many people. And oftentimes there is lack of awareness between teaching a specific faith tradition, which is perhaps most welcome in a yeshiva or in a seminary, right? But in, for instance, a public school or a publicly funded university, you know, advocating from my lectern for a specific religious denomination as compared with speaking into from my natural spirituality to that of my students, speaking of natural spirituality, strengthening through art and poetry, transcendent practice, mental health that's spiritually integrated. So the science that says the spiritual core exists in every human being is a science that can be used to make institutional transformation, and has. So the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute at Columbia is based on a scientific roadmap of adult development. And my work for 3 years with the Pentagon has been based on a spiritual roadmap derived through science. It's the yellow circle that for 2/3 of people is strengthened by the intersection. 2/3 of people say I'm spiritual and religious. My deep spiritual experience is held in the faith tradition of my family, the prayers, the texts, the community. And 1/3 of people will say I'm spiritual, but I am not religious, more with Gen Z. I feel spiritual in nature, with poetry and music. But the point is for an institution that there is no question, based on hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific articles, some from my lab, some from other labs, plenty of people at this point, that spirituality is an innate human capacity that, if strengthened, is foundational to the character strengths and virtues, as well as protective against the most prevalent diseases of despair in young adulthoods. And that is true across race and across class and across denomination. It is absolutely time and time again found. So knowing this, and this was the Pentagon's argument, and it went through their legal department, JAG, knowing this, are we not through omission, knowing of the tidal wave in the air and water of the culture, are we not through omission hanging that young person out in peril? That an act of omission and act of commission are both moral acts. And having this science gives higher education a roadmap on points of intervention, areas for faculty training, ways of, for instance, helping in mental health, behavioral health, collaborate with spiritual support. So there are many, many implications, but I think your point is valuable. I'm so grateful you put that in the middle of our shared table here, because the science says it is no longer a question of whose religion is being brought in or whose opinion is being brought in. It is a foundational human capacity that must be realized along with all others, physical, emotional, cognitive, for a whole functioning, healthy adult.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for answering that really important question. I see that we're on 7 o'clock, and I know there is one more question pending. Thea, are we allowed to go over time? I realise you have to go. Can we just show our appreciation by a symbol or just clapping?
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. And we realise you have to rush off, but as you can see from the questions and the response, it was very, very stimulating. And everyone now has a chance to go and look at your book and follow up the ideas in more detail.
Dr. Collicott, thank you for your collaboration. Thea, thank you for including me in the Oxford Interfaith Forum, and I can't wait to hear your talks in the weeks ahead. Thank you. Be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.